So we're going to get right into it. Code readability isn't just about personal preference, it's actually about developer accessibility. And to give a little bit more background, in addition to all the things that Sarah said, I am a disabled and neurodivergent web developer with a focus on web accessibility. I'm actually recently, within the last year, diagnosed as neurodivergent. I have ADHD, and it has made so many things make so much sense in my life, including this struggle that I had for a while. Being someone who's not new, I have going on 9 years experience coding and going on 5 years full-time working experience. But for several years, um, I wasn't always sure if it was me, like, because I was new at programming, that code was so hard to read. And over the years, as I've gained experience and confidence, I have learned it's not just me, it's the way my brain works. So I'm going to continue on. And before I really dive in, I want to help you get into a certain mindset. So think about your code writing tools. What features do they all share? How have they changed over time? Did you experience the release of any groundbreaking features? How have you changed over time yourself? What tricks and habits have you learned? What new skills have you learned? What programming languages have you learned? And if it's just one, that's totally fine too. We're all at different places in our journey. So, to demonstrate how things can change after a long period of time, or even after a short one, let's look at two particular tools. The first one is Microsoft Windows Notepad, and it had its first public release in 1985. I was not alive then, but it looks as I would expect it to. It's pretty basic. Computers were only capable of so much, in the 80s and even in the 90s. Um, there's not a lot to it, and Notepad has remained very basic. I think that's probably the foundation of that whole entire app. But here's what it looks like in 2022. I got this from the Windows Insider blog, and it's still really basic, but it has dark mode, which is kind of exciting. So another tool that you might be familiar with is Visual Studio Code, and it was released in 2015. And the screenshot is a little blurry and small, but it was the best that I could get from the original preview blog post, which I got from the Wayback Machine. Um, Thank you to Wikipedia for linking to that page, because there's no way I would have found it on my own. But here's what it looks like today in 2022. So it has dark mode by default. This screenshot is also much better quality. There's icons for each file type, and it's just a little bit, it's more compact. I'm sure there's a lot more customization that you can do. There's definitely way more extensions than there used to be, which is part of the beauty of Visual Studio Code, which is what I use in my programming. So um, there are quite a few differences in less than 10 years in Visual Studio Code itself. And the evolution of our coding tools is important. Looking at how things have changed helps us remember why we have the things that we're so used to today. So let's take a look at some code. This is an example Node.js application. I got it from a Get Started guide from the Node.js website. And if you have coded a Node.js application, this might look super familiar to you. And maybe you've seen this exact code, maybe you've written this exact code, but memory, only gets us so far when it comes to these things. And I don't really like this theme. I don't really like it at all. So we're just gonna start fresh. So this is the same code that I ran through a minifier, which just condenses the code into the smallest amount of space. It renames variables to make them one letters. It makes everything one line if it can. And yeah, can you imagine writing code like this all day? And maybe you do if it's fun. I was actually setting up um, my little website this morning, and I was writing HTML in Nano through an SSH session, and that was really difficult. I really missed my code editor when I was doing that. So let's try to clean this code up, and we'll look at all of the little individual things that make code more readable to us. And it's primarily things that we're already used to that just seem like the default, but they didn't used to be the default. So first of all, let's separate the lines. And that didn't do very much because technically this code can be condensed into 2 lines. That's a fun thing about JavaScript. You can declare variables all in one line. So that's what's going on with these commas and whatnot. And second thing that we're going to do, let's just break up some curly braces because those represent blocks. And that helps us break up these things into a few more lines, not many, but a couple. And then we're going to break it those commas and we're going to instantiate each of the variables separately. So now we have our HTTP, host name, port, server, and then this isn't a variable declaration, but we have everything on separate lines now. And now we can insert some spaces around some of our syntax. So we have some equal signs in here when we're declaring variables. We can add some spaces between function arguments and uh, before and after curly braces and all of those things. What else can we do? We can indent within blocks. And this font right here, I set it to Arial or something like it with the tool that I had. And they look really small, but those are 2-space indentations, which is something I am very accustomed to, but it looks really small. So now what we can also do is use the port variable. That's the purpose of variables, so that you can define things one time. And the minifier replaced some variables with the actual value and not all of them. So that was really weird. I don't know if that was what it was supposed to do or not. And what else? We can change the font style, which is probably something that really made our eyes hurt, made my eyes hurt looking at Arial that whole time. So we've got a monospace font now. And then we can separate the different blocks of logic. So the way we have this separated now is just like it was before. We have our imports and require statements up at the top, and then we have some constants that are defined typically for like the whole file is how this can go. And then we have the server variable that we create with create server, and that's broken up as it takes up multiple lines. Same thing with the server.listen call. What's next? We can rename some variables so that we actually know what they mean. So now we have request and result, and those are variables that are very common. Request doesn't get used, but naming the variable can help us with making this a little bit easier to understand. And then we can add a theme, which this is the theme that I use in VS Code. And we can add some more stuff like semicolons, which are optional in some places and not, depending on the language that you have. So how do I get buy-in from company leadership that this is worth investing in, making the lives of developers a lot easier? Well, the first thing is making code more readable means making it easier to understand. Making code easier to understand means making it easier to work with. Making code easier to work with means more chances for everyone to contribute, no matter their background or their knowledge or the way their brain works. More diverse contributions means more diverse and inclusive products. More inclusive products means more engaged and satisfied users. So I don't typically like approaching things with the business case first, but I do know that sometimes it's hard to convince leadership to do some things like this. I've worked in accessibility for a while, so I'm very aware of it. But let's take a look at the personal side of things first. Preference implies that there's a true and correct default that should be adhered to. So that's a word that I typically like to just avoid when it comes to things like readability. We do have preferences, but that can be a misnomer for some people. Sometimes your brain just needs things to be a certain way, and that same thing may be a preference to someone else. Preferences are analogous to conveniences, things that are helpful but optional. Accommodations cannot be implied as optional or as conveniences. They are always necessities. And then you might ask, isn't readability subjective? It definitely is. Accommodations can totally clash. Me as a deaf person, I really need closed captions when I'm listening to things. Shout out to this conference for having excellent captions. I love them. But there are a lot of people who can be distracted by captions as well, especially if they aren't accurate or anything like that. So what's important in conversations like this is to talk to each other with compassion and don't make the assumption that somebody is being nitpicky or just wanting to make your life harder or anything like that. All it takes is talking to each other and um, being kind and wanting to find balance. It can really build a lot of trust talking to each other about these kinds of things. And that's it for me. If you have questions, you can ask me on Twitter. I'll also be in the Discord channel. And if you want to check out some of my writing, I'm at ashleeandboyer.com. Thank you.